There's this absolutely amazing movie we've heard about. They say it's unlike any experience available anywhere, that we must see it, because otherwise existence is meaningless. But there's a catch. To go to this movie, we have to agree to incarnate on planet Earth. We arrive at the theater, and the first thing we notice is how uncomfortable and restrictive the seat is. So we kick and scream and cry and squirm, but gradually we acclimatize. And as we settle in, we begin to register colors and sounds and flavors and feels and, hey, this might be okay after all. Soon we can pull images together out of the swirling forms on the screen, and the whole process of recognition and naming begins. We begin to recognize characters and follow, if not entirely understand, the story. The truly magical thing about this movie is that it actually responds to us. We can even get the gods, mother and father, to react in particular ways by doing or saying certain things. Wow! But soon we also realize that no matter what we do, we can't get the movie to go exactly the way we want it to, and this tends to create an undercurrent of frustration which can color all of the other feelings we experience. As the years go on, we develop habits of meaning, so that whenever the plot gets confusing, we make up a narrative that makes sense and assume that this is the truth about what's going on. We also develop allegiances and routinely cheer or boo when certain characters appear or when certain things happen. In contrast to being intensely identified with certain elements of the movie, there are others we ignore so completely we don't even know they are there. Sometimes we become self-conscious when we see ourselves in the movie and notice that we're looking particularly fit or fat, appealing or appalling, and regard ourselves with heart-thumping pride or devastating shame. Sometimes we feel a bit dissociated, as if watching absently from a back row, as if this movie were about someone else. Sometimes we get desperately bored because we've seen this part of the movie over and over again. Sometimes the movie is actually exhilarating. Most people go on like this year after year, until finally the house light goes on, whether our story has come to a satisfying conclusion or not, and we are escorted out of the theater. But there's another scenario that evidently happens to some, I would say, very lucky people. At some point the only word that fits here is they awaken. They experience a heightened awareness right there in the midst of the movie. You could say it's a bit like having the lights in the theater come up slightly, so you can see the space and the others around you more clearly. You see the movie more objectively, as something you are observing rather than something you are caught in. And it's not just the scope of your awareness that changes. It feels as though your awareness is more deliberate, more choiceful. It's funny that when this first happened to me, I was literally in a movie theater, actually watching a movie, one of my favorites, King Kong. As I sat there feeling compassion for the simian beast, today we might call him the Shadow, a strange thing happened. Quite suddenly, I zoomed out, and for the next period of time, I was no longer watching the movie, I was watching the people watching the movie. Try as I might, I could not return the limits of my awareness to the edges of the screen. I kept popping back out and seeing how utterly absorbed everyone was in the perils of the giant ape. Of course, we all knew that Kong was an animated puppet, but that didn't seem to prevent us from being captivated by his plight. Then I zoomed out even further, and I was watching myself, watching the audience, mesmerized by the flickering images on the screen. Years later, when I had a more consistent meditation practice, I realized what a perfect metaphor that had been, because in a way, awakening is simply becoming aware of the screen of consciousness, that faculty on which we register and through which we define reality. The moment we are aware of that, we are no longer completely spellbound by the movie of our lives. But as useful as this metaphor may be in terms of providing perspective and enabling us to be less identified with the movie on the screen, it does raise some perplexing questions. How do I continue to be in this awakened state without losing my grip on the story? Isn't it emotionally unhealthy to become detached, to think of what I previously called reality as a cinematic confection? Does life then become less meaningful, less intense? Will I become less able to achieve my goals? What do I do with this? A couple of immediate reactions are possible, if not probable. One is to ignore the experience and just dive back into the story on the screen. Another is to decide that the tragicomedy on the screen is far, far more interesting than seeing ourselves watching the movie, and deliberately forget, even renounce, the possibility of awakening. But for some, the experience of seeing the screen of consciousness more objectively will be so intriguing that it must be explored. They might become fascinated by questions about the nature of the screen, how the images are generated, what its purpose is. These seekers might take a scientific approach, wanting to understand the energies creating the flow of images, the properties of the screen reflecting them, and the dynamics of the process. They are driven by a desire to redefine the movie experience in what we might call metaphysical terms. Others might be deeply touched by the experience of awakening because it reveals that there must be a greater reality within which this personal movie experience is happening. They might begin to regard that greater existence with deepening awe, realizing that they are witnessing a grand mystery at play. These seekers take a spiritual approach, wanting to draw into a meaningful relationship with that encompassing existence. They are driven by a growing love for all beings and actively seek communion with what they might call God or truth or the One. Still others will experience the jolt of awakening as a call to reconfigure their working relationship to what up to this moment they had called reality. But this quality of awareness, enabling them to both be fully engaged with and dispassionate observers of the movie, requires a new way of being. This lucid, creative engagement with reality is so subtle, so fluid, that it can only be maintained through dedicated practice. These seekers take a transformational approach, working on restructuring personal patterns of consciousness. They are driven by an evolutionary impulse, leading to a richness of experience unavailable to those who stay put in the dark hypnosis of the cinema. Becoming aware of, not just being swept along by, the movie is life-altering. Those for whom it becomes an experience which must be pursued probably continue to awaken through some combination of the scientific, the devotional, and the transformative approaches. These pathways complement and balance each other and eventually weave into a singular journey, a journey of illuminations. For example, we awaken to how absolutely transient the movie is. Nothing stays on the screen. Whatever enters, exits eventually. That's how it works. A motion picture runs at 24 distinct frames per second. Well, the movie we're talking about here runs at X number of distinct thoughts, feelings, and perceptions per second. Constant, inexorable change is the fundamental nature of the movie. The implications of this transience are pretty significant, the most obvious one being that getting overly attached in a positive or a negative way to anything on the screen is not very wise. Because sooner or later, quite often sooner than we would like or expect, it's gone. The inherent ephemerality of everything happening in the movie also raises important questions. How real or reliable is something that comes and goes? How do I engage sincerely with these characters, situations, and stories when I see how essentially insubstantial the movie is? How do I love with my whole being and yet yield to the robberies of time? And if this movie is not real, is there anything which is? Well, the only thing that's always here is that which is experiencing the movie. But what is that? Who is that? If that is more real, should I try to live from that core? How do I do that? And can I do that without devaluing the movie? Another life-changing illumination that dawns as we awaken comes from seeing the utter contingency of the movie. Everything in the movie relates to something else in one way or another. Nothing stands completely independent of reference to something else. Or to put it another way, anything that is not connected to other things is unlikely to hold our attention. In fact, the elements of our movie are meaningful to us because they connect to other meaningful things. That's how we understand and value them. This is especially true about the people and the things we really care about. We could say that the degree of attachment we have to certain people or situations is proportional to how many connecting threads they have to other parts of our movie. Most of those threads run off-screen, into the past or the future, because our caring is based largely on what we have experienced and what we hope to experience with those individuals or situations. And it's not just the past and the future which exist off-screen. What about the outlying connection points that make my movie meaningful in the moment? For example, as I write this script, I am aware of you, the viewer, not just as a future recipient of this video, but as someone I am addressing right now. Not only are you off screen, I don't even know who you are. This means that the entire movie is never on the screen. We only ever see a small, really small part of it. How different would our experience of the moment be if we realized that we are only seeing a momentary framing, a viewing box, something like a single cell on a vast spreadsheet? In the same way that I am unlikely to divine the meaning of a spreadsheet by only looking at one cell, my moment-by-moment understanding of the movie will always be partial, limited, contingent. The third life-disrupting illumination that comes with awakening is the illusory nature of the movie. Illusion in this sense is neither good nor bad. It's simply a basic characteristic of the movie. We might say that the movie is a film overlaid on reality. It's certainly related to that reality, but just as certainly not identical with it. The basic mechanism of this illusion is the screen itself. After all, the screen is a surface, and its effect is to keep us following along on that surface. The screen insists that we stay with the flow of images, characters, and situations that continually stream through the movie. We can't press pause, rewind, or fast forward, and if we stop and think too long about the meaning of something, we're liable to lose the thread of the story. And the screen exerts a strong hypnotic effect that virtually ensures we will stay in a state of consciousness which imbues the movie with a marvelous realism. The movie's illusory nature also creates the vivid impression that it is coming at us, like the broadcasts sent to our TVs. This feeds the sense that life is happening to me and tends to obscure my role in the generation of what's on the screen. It hides the fact that, to some extent, and I believe it's to a very great extent, each of us creates the movie. Psychologists have an apt term for this: projection. This is an extremely important illumination because it invites us to be both more creative about and responsible for what is happening right now. Awakening seems to be a journey without end. As we become more alive and free through our awareness of the movie, we discover fresh perspectives. We may come to realize how the seeming linearity of the movie, one frame or day after the next, hides from us the timelessness which is at the heart, paradoxically, of time itself. We may increasingly recognize that the truly important things, the deeper understanding, the great gifts of life, exist mainly off-screen, and that the movie is essentially a beautiful, intricate story, bejeweled with symbols pointing to those